Jake Morrison stared at his phone screen showing 47 unread messages sent to Emma at 3:17 a.m. His thumb hovering over the send button for message number 48. The blue glow illuminated tear-stained cheeks, and 3 empty Red Bull cans scattered across his Austin apartment's hardwood floor. 5 days. That's how long it had been since Emma walked out of his life, taking her vintage vinyl collection, her succulents, and apparently his ability to function like a normal human being. The apartment that once showcased his methodical nature now looked like a crime scene where organization had been brutally murdered. Takeout containers formed precarious towers on every surface, clothes created abstract art installations across the furniture, and somewhere beneath the chaos, his laptop still glowed with unfinished code from Tuesday. Jake had always prided himself on being logical. At 27, he was the senior software developer everyone turned to when systems crashed and deadlines loomed. His colleagues at the startup respected his analytical approach to problems, his ability to debug the most complex issues with surgical precision. He color-coded his calendar, meal prepped every Sunday, and maintained a gym routine that would make fitness influencers weep with envy. Emma used to joke that dating him was like having a personal life coach who also happened to give incredible back rubs. But logic had abandoned him the moment Emma sat him down on their IKEA couch and delivered the words that shattered his carefully constructed reality. I need space to figure myself out, and you need to stop making me your entire world. The conversation lasted 43 minutes, he'd calculated later, though it felt like seconds and eternities simultaneously. She'd been calm, rational, even kind, which somehow made it infinitely worse than if she'd screamed or thrown things, or given him something concrete to fix. His developer brain had immediately started troubleshooting. What was the bug in their relationship code? When had he introduced the error that caused this critical failure? He'd analyzed their last 6 months with the intensity of a security audit, searching for the moment everything went wrong. Was it? When he'd surprised her at work with lunch and she'd seemed uncomfortable. The time he'd reorganized her bookshelf while she was out of town. His suggestion that they should spend New Year's Eve together instead of with her friends. The digital stalking started innocently enough, just checking her Instagram once to see if she was okay. Then came the forensic analysis. Screenshot, timestamps, examining which mutual friends had liked her posts. Interpreting the hidden meaning behind her choice to share a sunset photo versus a coffee cup. His rational mind applied debugging logic to love, convinced that if he could identify the source of the problem, he could write a patch to fix it. By day 3, the behavior had escalated beyond recognition. He found himself driving past her new apartment near the UT campus, memorizing the cars in the parking lot to detect patterns in her schedule. He timed his grocery runs to H-E-B for moments when he might accidentally encounter her in the produce section. He crafted text messages with the precision of legal documents, editing and re-editing until each word carried the perfect weight of regret, understanding, and subtle persuasion. The breakthrough moment came at 2:47 a.m. when Jake discovered he was standing outside Emma's apartment complex on Rio Grande Street, wearing his pajama pants and a wrinkled t-shirt, having driven there in a fugue state he couldn't fully remember. Security cameras tracked his movement as he paced the sidewalk, phone pressed to his ear while leaving his 7th voicemail of the night. The words tumbled out in increasingly desperate streams of consciousness about second chances and misunderstandings, and how much he'd learned in the past 72 hours. Son, you need to go home. The University of Texas police officer emerged from the shadows like a gentle giant. Flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but not directly into Jake's eyes. The man's voice carried the weary patience of someone who'd seen this exact scenario play out countless times before. Probably with other heartbroken 20-somethings who'd lost their minds somewhere between the library and 6th Street. I just need to talk to her, Jake heard himself saying, the words sounding foreign and desperate even to his own ears. There's been a misunderstanding. If I could just explain properly. "That's not how this works," the officer replied, and something in his tone broke through Jake's manic fog. "This isn't love, son. This is something else." Jake found himself sitting in his Honda Civic in an empty H-E-B parking lot at 4 a.m., staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The stranger looking back had hollow eyes, stubble that suggested personal hygiene had become optional, and hands that trembled slightly as they gripped the steering wheel. When had he become this person? When had the guy who debugged complex systems for a living lost the ability to debug his own emotional operating system? The officer's words echoed in the silence. "This isn't love, son. This is something else." For the first time in days, Jake's analytical mind engaged with something other than emulated data. He thought about the addiction research he'd read during college, the neuroscience articles that had fascinated him back when other people's problems felt safely academic. Every symptom he'd studied was staring back at him from the mirror: obsessive thoughts, compulsive behaviors, inability to function normally, escalating actions despite negative consequences. The realization hit him like a system crash. He wasn't just missing Emma. He was experiencing withdrawal from her presence, from the dopamine hits of her attention, from the identity he'd constructed around being her boyfriend. The love he'd thought was pure and selfless had somehow morphed into something that looked suspiciously like addiction. Jake pulled out his phone and downloaded a habit-tracking app, the same type he used to monitor his fitness goals and work productivity. But instead of tracking workouts or coding hours, he created a new counter with a simple label: days without contacting Emma. The number stared back at him: 0. Tomorrow it would read 1, assuming he could make it through the next 20 hours without checking her social media, driving by her apartment, or crafting the perfect reconciliation text. Day 1 would begin with a simple decision to treat this like the addiction it clearly was. But first, he needed to understand what that actually meant. How do you detox from a person? How do you withdraw from love without losing your mind completely? And most importantly, how do you learn to be whole again when someone else had been serving as half your oxygen supply? When did loving someone become indistinguishable from needing them to breathe? When did I love you transform into I can't exist without you? Emma was right about everything, including the part that hurt most. He hadn't made her his whole world. He'd made her his entire life support system. Jake set his phone background to display the counter. Day 1. The number would become his anchor, his measurement of healing. A daily reminder that recovery was possible even when it felt impossible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in an empty parking lot in Austin, Texas, a broken software developer made the first logical decision he'd managed in almost a week. "Love is literally cocaine for your brain," Marcus said, sliding a scientific journal across the table at Radio Coffee on Barton Springs Road. "Same neural pathways, same dopamine flood, same withdrawal symptoms. Congratulations, bro, you're officially a junkie." Jake stared at the research paper through bloodshot eyes, the words blurring together like code after a 12-hour debugging session. Radio Coffee buzzed with its usual morning energy, laptop warriors claiming tables with elaborate setups of monitors and mechanical keyboards, UT students cramming for finals over breakfast tacos, local musicians nursing hangovers, and discussing last night's show at Anton's. The Ethiopian single aroma should have been comforting, but everything felt muted, like experiencing the world through frosted glass. His phone displayed day 3 on the lock screen, a number that felt simultaneously massive and pathetic. 3 whole days without texting Emma, and yet the urge to reach out pulsed through him like a migraine. He'd already opened Instagram 4 times this morning, thumb hovering over her profile before forcing himself to close the app. The withdrawal symptoms were real. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his coffee. His stomach churned, despite not having eaten anything substantial since Tuesday. And sleep had become a theoretical concept rather than an actual biological function. Marcus Rodriguez looked exactly the same as he had during their UT days. Except now, his vintage band t-shirts came from boutique stores rather than thrift shops. And his apartment in East Austin probably costs more than Jake's entire yearly salary back in college. At 29, Marcus had evolved into the kind of guy who could discuss cryptocurrency over craft cocktails and still somehow maintain the laid-back authenticity that made him impossible to dislike. He'd survived 3 major breakups, with the wisdom of someone who'd learned to surf emotional tsunamis instead of drowning in them. And his dating life operated on a rotation system that would make a Fortune 500 CEO proud. "I'm not addicted to anything," Jake protested, though even he could hear the weakness in his voice. "I just miss her. That's normal, right? People miss people they love." Marcus opened the journal to a highlighted section, his finger tracing lines of dense academic text. "Look at this study from Rutgers. Brain scans of people looking at photos of their recent exes showed activation in the same regions that light up in cocaine addicts when they see drug paraphernalia. The ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, the prefrontal cortex. Your brain literally processes Emma's absence the same way a crack addict processes withdrawal." The words hit Jake like physical blows. He'd always prided himself on being rational, logical, immune to the emotional chaos that seemed to derail other people's lives. But the evidence was staring him in the face, written in the language he trusted most, empirical data. The neuroscience didn't lie, and neither did his behavior over the past 72 hours. "But I love her," Jake said, and the desperation in his voice made nearby coffee drinkers glance over with mixtures of pity and secondhand embarrassment. "This isn't some addiction. What we had was real." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with the analytical gaze of someone who'd learned to read people's emotional source code. "I'm not questioning whether you love her. I'm questioning whether what you're doing right now has anything to do with love. When you drove to her apartment at 3 in the morning, was that love? When you've checked her Instagram 17 times today, is that love? Or is that your brain desperately seeking its next hit of amah-flavored dopamine?" The brutal honesty stung because it rang true. Jake tried to mount a defense, to explain how his behavior made perfect sense if Marcus would just understand the context, the history, the unique circumstances of their relationship. But every justification sounded increasingly hollow when filtered through the lens of addiction science. Marcus continued with surgical precision. "Emma didn't leave because you had one fight or because she met someone else. She left because your love had become suffocating instead of supportive. When someone becomes your entire emotional ecosystem, that's not romantic. It's terrifying. She couldn't breathe because you'd wrapped yourself around her like emotional plastic wrap. So what am I supposed to do?" Jake's voice cracked on the question. "Just pretend she never existed. Act like 14 months meant nothing. You're going to detox." Marcus pulled out his own phone and opened a notes app filled with what looked like a detailed battle plan. 30 days, minimum. Complete no-contact protocol. That means no texting, no calling, no checking her social media, no asking mutual friends for updates, no accidentally showing up places you know she'll be. Jake's engineering brain immediately started calculating workarounds, loopholes in the system. But what if there's an emergency? What if she needs something she left at my place? What if she reaches out first? Emergency. You'll forward it to her family or her roommate, her stuff. You'll have a mutual friend handle the exchange. She reaches out. You don't respond for 30 days, period. Marcus's tone carried the authority of someone who'd field-tested this protocol multiple times. "This isn't negotiable, Jake. You're not capable of casual contact right now. Asking you to have just one conversation with Emma is like asking an alcoholic to have just one beer." The comparison made Jake flinch, but he couldn't deny its accuracy. Every interaction with Emma since the breakup had ended with him wanting more, needing more, plotting ways to extend the connection just a little longer. The rational part of his brain understood that Marcus was right, but the addicted part was already generating counter-arguments and escape clauses. "What if she's waiting for me to fight for us?" Jake asked, grasping at the romantic narratives that had sustained him through 3 sleepless nights. "What if this is just a test of how much I care?" Marcus's expression softened slightly, but his words remained firm. "Jake, listen to yourself. You're creating fantasy scenarios to justify behavior that got you a police warning 3 nights ago. Emma didn't give you a puzzle to solve or a test to pass. She gave you clear, direct communication about what she needs, and you've spent the last week trying to find ways around respecting that boundary, as if summoned by the universe's sense of dramatic timing." Jake's phone buzzed against the table. Emma's name appeared on the screen with a text that made his stomach drop through the floor. "I heard you were at my apartment. This has to stop." The words hit like a physical blow, but worse was the realization they brought. Someone had told Emma about his late-night visit, which meant other people had witnessed his breakdown, discussed his behavior, probably expressed concern for Emma's safety. The shame burned deeper than heartbreak, a full-body flush of embarrassment that made him want to disappear into the coffee shop's exposed brick walls. Marcus watched Jake's face crumble as the reality sank in. Emma wasn't playing hard to get or testing his devotion. She was genuinely afraid of his behavior, concerned enough to reach out despite wanting space. The romantic narrative he'd constructed around their breakup shattered like poorly written code, hitting a logic error. "She's scared of me," Jake whispered, the admission scraping his throat raw. "I've become the kind of person who scares the woman I love." Marcus reached across the table and took Jake's phone before he could formulate a response. "We're going to fix this right now. What do you want to say to her?" Together, they crafted a message that felt like swallowing glass. "You're right. I'm sorry for scaring you. I need time to work on myself. I won't contact you again." The words captured everything Jake needed to communicate, while containing none of the desperate explanations or promises his heart wanted to include. Before Jake could second-guess the decision, Marcus hit send. The message disappeared into the digital void, carrying with it Jake's last direct connection to Emma for the foreseeable future. "Now we delete," Marcus said, and methodically began the digital detox protocol, unfollowing Emma on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, blocking her number temporarily to remove temptation. Scrolling through Jake's camera roll and moving photos of Emma to a hidden folder that would require deliberate effort to access. Each deletion felt like a small death, but also like removing infected code from a corrupted system. With every digital connection severed, Jake felt simultaneously more isolated and more clear-headed. The constant potential for contact had been feeding his obsession, creating infinite opportunities for hope and disappointment. "Here's your challenge. For the next 27 days, Marcus said, leaning forward with the intensity of a coach delivering a game-changing strategy. "Can you learn to love yourself as intensely as you loved Emma? Can you invest the same energy in your own growth that you were pouring into trying to fix your relationship?" Jake stared at his phone's new lock screen. Day 3, accompanied by his second counter Marcus had helped him create, days of self-love practice. The dual trackers represented his commitment to both elimination and replacement, detox and recovery. For the first time in days, Jake felt something other than desperation. Not optimism exactly, but curiosity. What would happen if he redirected all that obsessive energy toward understanding himself, instead of analyzing Emma? What if the next 27 days could transform him into someone capable of healthy love, instead of addictive attachment? He thought love meant being willing to do anything for someone. He never considered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is learn to exist without them. Marcus was right about everything, including the truth that hurt most. He wasn't loving Emma. He was using her to avoid the harder work of loving himself. Day 12. Jake found himself lying on his bathroom floor at 2 a.m., fully clothed, staring at the ceiling tiles and wondering if this crushing chest pain was a heart attack or just his soul imploding. The tile pattern reminded him of Emma's kitchen backsplash, and even that connection felt like betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on him. A guy who'd spent years debugging complex systems couldn't figure out why his own operating system had crashed so spectacularly. His apartment had transformed into something unrecognizable, a testament to how quickly order could dissolve into chaos when the person maintaining it stopped caring about maintenance. The blackout curtains he'd installed to block out Austin's relentless sunshine now felt like prison walls, trapping him in a world where time moved differently, where days blended into nights without the normal markers of human existence. Outside his windows, the city pulsed with its usual energy. 6th Street hummed with neon and noise. Food trucks gathered in Zilker Park for another weekend festival. And somewhere in the distance, live music spilled from venues that had made Austin the live music capital of the world. But Jake's universe had contracted to the dimensions of his living room, where takeout containers formed archaeological layers documenting his descent into functional depression. The confident software developer, who used to tackle impossible deadlines with methodical precision, had been replaced by someone he didn't recognize. Morning routines that once anchored his days disappeared entirely. The gym membership he'd maintained religiously for 3 years gathered digital dust. His color-coded calendar, once a masterpiece of time management, now displayed vast empty blocks punctuated only by work meetings he barely managed to attend. His boss had started sending increasingly concerned emails, the tone shifting from professional inquiry to genuine worry about his sudden drop in productivity. Jake's code reviews, usually thorough and insightful, had become perfunctory at best. The analytical mind that once brought clarity to complex problems now operated in endless loops, churning through the same thoughts with the efficiency of a broken algorithm stuck in infinite recursion. Sleep had become a foreign concept. When exhaustion finally dragged him toward unconsciousness, his dreams populated themselves with versions of conversations he should have had with Emma, alternate timelines where he'd said the right words or made different choices. He'd wake disoriented, reaching for a phone that no longer contained her contact information, muscle memory betraying him every morning as reality reasserted itself. The physical symptoms hit harder than anything Marcus's research had prepared him for. His appetite vanished, reducing meals to mechanical fuel consumption when his body demanded it. Anxiety attacks struck without warning, waves of panic that made him feel like he was drowning in his own living room, gasping for air that felt too thin to sustain life. His hands developed a slight tremor that reminded him uncomfortably of his grandfather's Parkinson's. Though Jake's shaking came from withdrawal rather than disease, the self-medication started innocently enough. Netflix had helpfully saved their shared viewing history, and Jake found himself gravitating toward shows they'd watched together, seeking comfort in familiar narratives. The Thai restaurant they'd discovered during their 3rd month of dating still had his order memorized, and somehow the green curry tasted like memories, even when it arrived cold from delivery delays. Emma's old UT sweatshirt hung in his closet like a ghost, and wearing it felt like wrapping himself in her presence. The lavender scent had long since faded, replaced by his own smell, but the fabric held the shape of her shoulders, the way she'd push the sleeves up when she was concentrating on her laptop. When these attempts at connection brought more agony than comfort, Jake swung violently in the opposite direction. One evening, in a fit of rage that surprised him with its intensity, he gathered everything that reminded him of Emma and shoved it into garbage bags. Photos, gifts, the coffee mug she'd claimed as her own, even books she'd recommended. The shared Spotify playlists disappeared with methodical efficiency, each deletion feeling like erasing pieces of his own history. He seriously considered breaking his lease, abandoning the apartment where they'd built their life together, starting fresh somewhere Emma's ghost couldn't follow him. The impulse felt logical in his sleep-deprived state. Change the environment completely. Eliminate all triggers. Rebuild from scratch in a place with no emotional landmines. Day 14 brought the collapse he'd been unconsciously building toward. Whole Foods on a Tuesday afternoon should have been routine, mundane, safe. But as Jake wandered the aisles in a dissociative haze, trying to remember what normal people bought for sustenance, the speakers delivered Vienna by Billy Joel with Casual Cruelty, Emma's favorite song, the one she'd hum while making coffee, the one that played during their first road trip to Houston, the soundtrack to lazy Sunday mornings when the future felt infinite and bright. The melody hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly the cereal aisle became a war zone where he couldn't breathe. The breakdown was spectacular in its completeness. 27 years of emotional control shattered against the backdrop of organic granola and free-range everything. Concerned shoppers offered help while maintaining the careful distance people reserve for public mental health crises. Store security appeared with practiced efficiency, and Jake found himself being escorted to the parking lot like someone who posed a threat to public safety. Sitting in his Honda Civic for 2 hours afterward, Jake finally understood what was happening to him. This wasn't just missing Emma. This was grieving the version of himself that had felt worthy of love only when reflected in her eyes. For 14 months, he'd existed as half of a couple, defining his value through her responses to his affection. Without her mirror, he couldn't see himself at all. The drive to Town Lake felt automatic, muscle memory guiding him to the pedestrian bridge that connected the city's north and south shores. Kayakers navigated the water below, their movements purposeful and graceful, while the Austin skyline sparkled in the late afternoon sun like a promise of possibilities he'd been too consumed to notice. The city he'd called home for 5 years stretched out before him, full of life he'd forgotten existed beyond the boundaries of his relationship. His call to Marcus came with a voice cracked from crying and dehydration. "I don't think I know who I am without someone to love," Jake admitted, the words feeling like a confession of some fundamental failure. Marcus's response cut through the static of self-pity with characteristic precision. "That's not a bug, Jake. That's the feature you're trying to build." The reframe hit Jake like good code, clicking into place. His identity crisis wasn't a problem to be solved, but a skill to be developed. Learning to exist as a complete person instead of half of a couple wasn't punishment for loving too much. It was the foundation for loving better. Instead of continuing his attempts to eliminate the pain through deletion and avoidance, Jake made a radical decision that night. He would study his emotional patterns with the same analytical intensity he brought to debugging complex systems. The journal he started wasn't therapy exactly, but data collection, documentation of his self-worth patterns, his abandonment fears, his addiction to being needed rather than simply being valued. Day 15 dawned, with a new commitment, understanding himself with the same obsessive focus he'd once devoted to understanding Emma. The breakdown at Whole Foods hadn't been a failure of his recovery process. It had been data, information about which triggers still held power over his emotional operating system. He spent so much energy trying to be the perfect boyfriend that he forgot to be a complete person. Emma didn't leave because he loved her wrong. She left because he didn't love himself at all. How can you share a life with someone who doesn't have one? Jake updated his phone to display day 15, but now he added a third tracker, days of authentic self-discovery. The counter-evolution reflected his growing understanding that recovery wasn't about subtraction. It was about addition, building the person he'd never learned to be when someone else was serving as his primary source of identity and worth. Day 18. Jake stood in the climbing gym at Austin Bouldering Project, chalk dust coating his hands, staring up at a route that looked impossible. The woman next to him, mid-40s with calloused hands and laugh lines, said, "The rock doesn't care about your heartbreak, honey. It just wants to know if you're willing to try." 3 days had passed since his breakdown at Whole Foods, and Jake was slowly discovering that leaving his apartment didn't automatically trigger another emotional collapse. The climbing gym occupied a converted warehouse in East Austin's industrial corridor, where old manufacturing spaces had been transformed into temples of recreation and creativity. Steel beams stretched toward exposed ceilings 30 feet above, and the constant sound of climbers encouraging each other created an acoustic backdrop that somehow felt more soothing than the silence of his isolation. Outside, food trucks lined the streets serving Korean barbecue fusion to tech workers grabbing lunch between meetings, and massive murals declared "Keep Austin Weird" in colors bold enough to challenge the relentless Texas sun. The neighborhood pulsed with the kind of authentic energy that made people fall in love with Austin before the tech boom, when weirdness was still affordable and creativity hadn't been priced out to the suburbs. Sarah Martinez had been working the same route for 20 minutes when Jake first noticed her, methodically attempting different approaches with the patience of someone who understood that progress came in increments rather than breakthroughs. At 44, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate adversity without letting it define her. Her hands bore the calluses of serious climbing, and when she spoke, her voice carried the direct honesty of someone who'd stopped wasting time on polite fiction years ago. "First time?" she asked, catching Jake staring at the wall of colored holds like it was written in an alien language. Her eye contact was steady, the kind that saw through whatever bullshit people use to protect themselves from genuine connection. "You've got that deer-in-headlights look that screams my therapist told me to try new activities." Jake laughed despite himself, the first genuine emotion he'd felt in weeks that wasn't directly related to Emma, or his spectacular failure at being human. "Something like that? More like my friend told me I needed to get out of my apartment before I became a cautionary tale about what happens when software developers stop showering." Sarah's response was a knowing nod that suggested she'd walked similar territory. "Divorce?" she asked, chalking her hands with practiced efficiency. "Breakup? Death in the family? I've seen every variation of life falling apart walk through those doors. The Rock doesn't judge, but it also doesn't lie. You can't fake your way up a wall." The climbing community that Sarah introduced him to operated on principles Jake had never encountered in his professional world. Progress was measured in increments that outsiders couldn't see, the ability to trust a hold that looked insufficient, the confidence to make a dynamic move without guaranteeing the outcome, the willingness to fall and try again without treating failure as evidence of fundamental inadequacy. His engineering brain initially approached climbing like any other system to be optimized. He researched technique videos, analyzed his failures for patterns, and created spreadsheets tracking his progression through different route grades. But climbing operated on different logic than code. Emotional recovery, he was learning, followed similar rules. Non-linear, messy, requiring comfort with uncertainty that his methodical mind found deeply unsettling. Morning climbs, before work, became his new routine, replacing the gym sessions he'd abandoned during his isolation phase. His pale indoor skin slowly adapted to Austin's sunshine filtering through the warehouse windows, and muscles he'd forgotten existed began remembering their purpose. Tuesday night bouldering sessions introduced him to characters he never would have encountered in his tech bubble. Artists working restaurant jobs to fund their creative projects, veterans using climbing to process trauma, retirees rediscovering physical capability. After decades of office work, each route presented a puzzle that couldn't be solved through pure analysis. The holds required trust, the movements demanded faith in his body's ability to navigate space without guaranteed outcomes. Jake found himself applying lessons from the wall to his journal entries, documenting not just his Emma-related thoughts, but the patterns of self-doubt that climbing illuminated with uncomfortable clarity. Day 22 brought the test he'd been unconsciously building toward. The V4 route he'd been projecting for a week stretched up the wall like a vertical maze. each hold precisely placed to challenge different aspects of technique and mental fortitude. V4 represented a significant jump in difficulty from the easier climbs he'd been completing, requiring the kind of commitment that his recovering emotional system wasn't sure it could handle. Halfway up the route, Jake's body froze as completely as his laptop during a particularly brutal system crash. The next hold looked impossibly small, positioned at an angle that would require him to trust his feet on holds he couldn't see. Fear flooded his nervous system with the same intensity he'd felt during his panic attacks, but this time he was 40 feet off the ground, with 20 strangers watching. The old Jake would have downclimbed immediately, retreating to the safety of the ground with his dignity intact and his comfort zone unchallenged, but Sarah's voice cut through his panic with surgical precision. "You're not falling because you're not good enough. You're falling because you're not trusting yourself." The words landed like code finally compiling after hours of debugging. Jake adjusted his grip, breathed into the fear instead of fighting it, and made the move that had seemed impossible moments before. The hold felt solid under his fingers. His feet found purchase on the small edges below, and suddenly he was moving upward again with a fluidity that surprised him more than anyone watching. Topping out the route felt like more than just a physical achievement. The burst of endorphins unlocked something that had been locked away since Emma left, a sense of capability that existed independent of external validation. In the gym's cafe afterward, journaling over coffee that actually tasted good, instead of like caffeinated survival fuel, Jake wrote his first entry about Emma that didn't center on missing her or analyzing their relationship's failure. "I'm grateful she left," he wrote, the words feeling foreign but true, because staying would have prevented us both from growing into who we're supposed to become. The breakthrough wasn't dramatic or cinematic. No orchestral swells or a moment of perfect clarity, just the quiet recognition that he'd been approaching his entire life like that climb, focused so intensely on not falling that he'd forgotten to enjoy the movement, to trust his ability to navigate challenges without guaranteeing the outcome. Jake signed up for a weekend climbing trip to Reimer's Ranch, his first overnight adventure without the safety net of his controlled apartment environment. The prospect of camping under Texas stars, of waking up somewhere that held no memories of Emma, felt like curiosity rather than terror. Day 25 approached with anticipation instead of dread, marked by genuine interest in who he was becoming rather than mourning for who he used to be. He thought strength meant holding on tighter, white-knuckling his way through difficulty until willpower overcame obstacles through sheer force. But watching these climbers, studying their movement and philosophy, he was learning that real strength looked different. It meant knowing when to adjust your grip, when to trust your body's wisdom, when to move forward even when the next hold wasn't guaranteed. Maybe love worked the same way, requiring the same balance of commitment and flexibility, the same willingness to trust without demanding certainty. Jake updated his phone display to show day 22. But now the counter shared screen space with climbing route logs and personal achievement notes. The number had evolved from mere survival tracking to progress celebration, transforming from a tool of restriction into one of empowerment. The counter measured not just days without Emma, but days of building something worth sharing when he was ready to share it again. Day 30. Jake sat in the same radio coffee booth where Marcus had delivered his love is cocaine intervention. But this time he wasn't hiding from the world. He was observing it. The morning rush flowed around him like water around a stone, and for the first time in months, he felt solid. Austin morning burst with the kind of energy that made transplants fall in love with Texas, despite the heat, the traffic, and the rapidly rising cost of living. Breakfast taco lines wrapped around food trucks like daily pilgrimages. Joggers claimed the sidewalks with the determination of people who'd figured out that fitness was cheaper than therapy, and the city awakened with the confidence of a place that knew exactly what it was and didn't apologize for any of it. Radio coffee buzzed with its familiar symphony of espresso machines and laptop keyboards. But Jake experienced it differently now. What used to feel like background noise to his emotional drama had transformed into the soundtrack of a life he was actively choosing to live. The Ethiopian single origin still tasted the same, but his relationship to the experience had fundamentally shifted. He wasn't consuming coffee to fuel his obsession or hide from reality. He was simply enjoying coffee because it tasted good, and the morning light through the windows reminded him that he was alive. The man sitting in the corner booth bore little resemblance to the hollow-eyed wreck who'd occupied this same space a month ago. Lean muscle from daily climbing had replaced the soft edges of depression, and Austin's sunshine had given his skin the kind of healthy glow that came from spending time outdoors, instead of marinating in artificial light. His eyes met contact instead of avoiding it, and the journal beside his laptop served a different purpose entirely. Instead of rumination and analysis, it captured insights, tracked genuine progress, documented the fascinating process of becoming someone he actually liked. Jake's phone displayed day 30 alongside, climbing route logs and weekend plans that didn't revolve around anyone else's schedule. The counter had evolved through multiple iterations, measuring different aspects of growth as his understanding of recovery deepened. What started as mere survival tracking had transformed into something approaching celebration, a daily reminder that healing was possible even when it felt impossible. The universe, apparently possessing the same sense of dramatic timing that governed romantic comedies and Greek tragedies, chose that precise moment to deliver its final test. Emma walked through Radio Coffee's front door with someone new, and Jake's nervous system registered her presence before his conscious mind processed what was happening. His heart rate elevated. Muscle memory from 14 months of loving her triggered familiar patterns of attention and awareness. But instead of the panic or plotting strategies that would have consumed the old Jake, he found himself experiencing something unprecedented: curiosity. Curiosity about his own reaction, about her apparent happiness, about this moment as fascinating data rather than existential crisis. Emma looked different, not dramatically, but in the subtle ways that suggested someone who'd been doing their own work, making their own discoveries about who they were when they weren't defining themselves through someone else's needs. Her friend was clearly platonic, a girlfriend laughing over iced lattes and weekend plans, with the easy intimacy of people who'd learned to enjoy each other's company without complication. Jake observed his thoughts without being consumed by them, like a scientist studying an interesting phenomenon rather than a subject trapped inside the experiment. The analytical skills that had once fueled his obsession now served a different master, cataloging his emotional responses with detached fascination. This was what emotional sobriety looked like, he realized. Not the absence of feeling, but the ability to feel without being controlled by the feeling. When Emma noticed him and approached his table, the conversation that followed lasted exactly 3 minutes but contained a lifetime of growth compressed into carefully chosen words. She said, "You look different, healthier," with the kind of genuine observation that came from someone who'd been worried about him but hadn't known how to help. "I'm learning to be complete on my own," he responded, and the simplicity of the statement surprised him. No elaborate explanations about his recovery process, no subtle attempts to demonstrate how much he'd grown, no hidden agendas designed to reopen possibilities between them. Just honest communication about his current reality, delivered without desperation or performance. They exchanged updates with the careful politeness of people who'd shared something meaningful, but recognized that sharing it again would be moving backward rather than forward. Emma mentioned her new job, her therapy, her gradual process of figuring out who she was when she wasn't trying to fix someone else's emotional architecture. Jake talked about climbing, about his weekend trip to Reimer's ranch, about discovering muscles he'd forgotten he possessed. "I'm proud of you," Emma said before returning to her friend. And Jake realized with something approaching amazement that he was proud of himself too. Not for impressing her or proving his worth, but for doing the work that had seemed impossible a month ago. for learning to exist as a complete person, instead of half of a couple desperately seeking completion. After Emma left, Jake sat with the interaction's aftermath like a climber assessing a route after completing it. No urge to text her later. No analyzing her words for hidden meanings that might suggest romantic possibility. No regression into the obsessive patterns that had defined his previous month. Instead, he felt something entirely foreign to his previous experience. Genuine gratitude for their relationship's contribution to his growth, combined with genuine contentment with his current trajectory. The detox hadn't just been completed, it had transformed into something sustainable. A new way of relating to love that didn't require the other person to serve as his primary source of identity and worth. Emma had been a mirror for 14 months, reflecting back a version of himself that felt worthy of affection. But mirrors, he'd learned, were poor substitutes for actual self-knowledge. Jake updated his phone one final time, changing the display from its various iterations of counting and tracking to something simpler and more honest. Days of growth, 30. The number no longer represented restriction or survival. It marked the beginning of a fundamentally different approach to loving. One that started with himself and extended outward from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. The counting app disappeared entirely, replaced by a photo from his climbing trip to Reimer's ranch. The image captured him at the top of a challenging route, arms raised, not in victory over the rock, but in celebration of trusting himself, enough to attempt something that had seemed impossible. The photo reminded him daily that growth happened incrementally, that trust was built through practice, that the most rewarding challenges were often the ones that scared him most. 30 days ago, losing Emma had felt like losing everything that mattered. Today, he understood that losing her had been the catalyst for finding himself. Not the version that needed constant validation from external sources, but the person who'd been worth loving all along, hidden underneath layers of insecurity and addiction to being needed. He was ready to share his life again, but only with someone who enhanced the person he'd become, rather than someone he needed to complete him. The difference felt as significant as the gap between addiction and love, between desperation and choice, between existing as half of something and thriving as a whole person who happened to enjoy company. The counter had taught him to measure healing, to track progress through the wilderness of withdrawal and recovery. Now he was ready to live without measuring, to trust his ability to navigate relationships from a place of strength rather than need. Day 30 wasn't an ending, it was a commencement. The beginning of a life worth sharing when the right person came along to appreciate what he'd built.